going on, my friends? I am Rick, and this is your seat at the table, and you hear some thumping going on in the background. I have Frankie the shelter cat playing with the door, along with Cece, the former stray cat that we adopted. What you may or may not know is that a year ago, the lady across the street passed away, and she'd been feeding what she called the neighborhood cats. It's about a dozen or so, an actual clouder of cats. If you've never seen a clouder, then I've got some videos for you. And anyway, one of the mama cats last summer had some kittens, and one of them was kind of the runt, and she didn't seem like she was going to do so hot outside. And the wife decided to take her in the house. So she's now in the house. Anyway, we were talking about BattleTech, and this is the Mercenaries Handbook from Facet. This would have been the 3025 version early on, and one of the iconic things about BattleTech is that you can't really talk BattleTech and not have mercenaries come up into the conversation at some point. This was produced 1987 by FASA, and a cornerstone of the military forces for both large and small across the board. And there's been mercenaries, it's said that the world's oldest profession is, quote, and I'm not going to say it, but there could be a toss-up there, because I've always argued that the world's oldest profession also could have been the mercenary. People who are willing to fight and perhaps die for money, or politicians. So there's kind of a toss-up between those three particular professions. So anyway, what we have here is a pretty extensive book, and I used it quite a lot. It's seen some mileage. You can see once again the bindings are coming apart. Typical FASA production. We have our introduction. So the handbook is split into three parts. First chapters discuss a variety of various aspects of mercenary life in the year 3025. The latter chapters are game rules and systems for role-playing the features of a mercenary life, and then the appendix contains description of 3 mercenary units. The Iridani Light Horse, Hansen's Rough Riders, Wolf's Dragoons. In the age of battle mech warfare, these mercenary units and others like them spearhead the battle forces of the great houses. As the succession wars rage across the crumbling remnants of the Star League, it is this new breed of Condidari, don't ask me to pronounce that right, that dominates the battlefields of hundreds of distant worlds. As a supplement to MechWarrior, the Mercenaries Handbook examines the role of mercenary soldiers and the units in a BattleTech environment, examines the composition, economics, and employment of mercenary mech warriors, and provides gamers with combat rules for running large-scale campaigns easily. The rules on expenses, contracts, treachery, house policies also allow the player characters to roleplay every aspect of the mercenary life. Players may use these rules in several different ways, etc., etc. So, to sum it up, the Mercenaries Handbook is a set of guidelines that describe the business of mech warfare. Game masters and players should use this material to augment, not to replace the material found in MechWarrior, blah, blah, blah. All right, so, creating a mech unit. Let's see, creating a mercenary unit provides a streamlined system for creating large mercenary units. Subscription chapters. Game systems for determining operating expenses, contracts, missions, and combat campaigns are based on the unit creation system. Game masters can also use the rules and the cost of living to compute expenses for a mercenary unit. Salaries, maintenance costs, overhead, transportation fees are all considered. The creating contracts chapter, the game master will find several hints on generate blah, blah, blah. So mercenary units. With warfare an accepted part of everyday life and competition rife between great houses, minor houses, periphery warlords, bandit kings, mercantile combines, and anyone else with money and motivation to make a play for resources or power, the profession of arms has reached new heights of respect and importance. The limited availability of war machines and trained men left every interested party in known space scrambling to find capable soldiers and mechs. Professional unit with a good reputation was in the enviable situation of the proverbial man with a better mousetrap. Was it any wonder mercenary troops became a staple of the successor states? From under four flags, my life as a mercenary, Major Charlene Fellows, New Avalon Press, 3022. A mercenary soldier who fights purely for monetary gain is selling his fighting skills to the highest bidder because he cares nothing for political, religious, economic, or philosophical causes at stake. Mercenary is often despised and rarely given the credit for his talents or abilities. Despite all this, the services of a hireling soldier are almost always in demand. The Succession War era is ideal setting for mercenary operations. There are no dramatic causes or sweeping principles of right or wrong among the potential employers. Mercenaries can offer their service to the highest bidder, untroubled by conscience, etc., etc. History of BattleTech. Mercenaries. Before Alexander Kerensky disappeared into periphery 3/4 of the regular army in 2784, the startling military was a pillar of peace and prosperity, a bastion against the rising tide of chaos. Mercenaries were not yet common because the regular army was too strong to need them, and its occasional opponents were too weak to track professionals. Even for money, mercenaries were not particularly interested in fighting for a lost cause. That's true, but it's not true in some. It's a matter of how you view this, right? So professional soldiers, professional security personnel, uh, rent-a-cops, for example, are a form of a mercenary. People who don't swear an oath and serve a purpose. I mean, they don't they don't join a professional military defense force of some sort, but end up working for or in a police capacity or something like this. But our society today, mercenaries exist. They're not that prominent. You don't hear a lot of stories about them, but they are there. The occasional story surfaces and things like this. But any place with serious security issues or has interest in protecting their turf hires people to do that. In some arguments, that is a typical mercenary. You're selling your services to an employer. You know, you join the military of your country to serve the country and your fellow citizens, not necessarily just to make a buck. I mean, you're not going to get as paid as well as a soldier in the U.S. Army than you would be if you were a private security consultant for, you know, a high-end corporation. Just saying. You can make that argument however you wish. So anyway, we've got type of mercenary units, and just about every kind of possible military unit that you can field in your house. There's a mercenary equivalent of it. Mechs are not the end all, the beat all. Probably the lion's share of mercenary units are more equipped with combined arms, infantry, and armored vehicles because they're cheaper and easier to maintain. And whenever they can, they want to field battle mechs because battle mechs are relative to the inner sphere and to the world as the universe as everybody knows it. But it's not always the case. So it's quite possible to hire mercenary commands that are totally infantry based or totally combined arms and have no mechs in them at all. Just like there's aerospace mercenary units that you can employ. The only thing you won't find is a mercenary warship, and that's because they don't exist. And you wouldn't have found them at the height of the Star League or the beginning of this first Succession War, because one of the reasons we don't see warships in modern BattleTech in 3025 is that they were all destroyed by the Second Succession War. The lion's share of them were obliterated in the First Succession War. Every house had hundreds, and by the end of the First Succession War, they had dozens of warships. The bulk of the remaining warships of the SLDF fleet went with Kerensky. Some 500 odd warships went with him, and they returned as part of the clans. Some of them did. So we didn't, and even when the clans return, they don't bring overwhelming numbers of warships. So someplace somewhere in the deep periphery, in and around clan space, are still mothballed fleets of warships, or they deteriorated to the point where they were unserviceable and they started scrapping them, using them to maintain the ones that they do field and that they do operate. And it's just my opinion. I have no proof in lore, but I believe that that's so. And anyway, so we talk about the types, organization, the business of war, profit and loss, salaries. That's the key thing. Many mercenary units actually work on a margin. They're always, I don't want to say flush, they're always, and they're not always strapped for cash, but funding is always a concern. One of the downsides for mercenary life is that you're financially responsible to support and maintain your own equipment. Now you might get a contract where your employer will alleviate some of this, or even 100% of it, but you take it in the wallet when you do this. It behooves you to be able to have as much technical force to maintain your equipment as you can possibly employ. Meanwhile, you still need to acquire the parts, the materials, the armor, damaged equipment, replacement weapons, munitions. All this stuff is coming out of your bottom line. If you have a contract with your house, you're in danger of becoming the company store syndrome, where you end up owing more to your employer than what your employer is paying you, and then you can't. You're a mercenary in name only at this point. You're an indentured unit. So this is important. And another aspect of the mercenary life, traditionally, mercenary combat personnel, technical support, mercenaries tend to get paid better than a house unit does. There's reasons for that. One is you join the mercenary unit life to make some money, to be paid for what you know how to do and how you do well. Once again, the majority of people who join the house militaries, the government militaries, are doing it for other reasons. They're either doing it as a sense of obligation because that's what their family's done before them, because it's an opportunity for furthering education and future prospects after the service, after you get out. It's common in BattleTech for a lot of people to, especially MechWarriors, to actually be generational and to be long term. It's not uncommon for this is their career, so they join the military, become a mech pilot, and remain a mech pilot for their house until they're either dead or retirement age. And ideally, they get promoted and increase through the time. But for every person that does that, there's probably 50 who comes in, serves a certain amount of time, a duration, and then they muster out and go on to civilian life. And in some aspects or some ways, some of these people transition over into the mercenary life, but that's not always the case. It's just like mercenaries. A lot of mercenaries have been around for centuries. This means they're a family unit. A lot of these people's families have served under their banner of their merc unit for generations, and the next generation will do the same. It's a tradition, right? So profit and loss, salaries, profit sharing, consumables, maintenance and refit, overhead, and other expenses. A mercenary unit can incur a variety of other expenses over and above those already discussed. Some result from the deficiencies in unit organization, such as charges to transport a force lacking its own drop or jump ships. Others are irregular payments that are essential to the unit's survival or smooth functioning, such as bribes to private contractors or government officials, payoffs to informers in the enemy camp, ransoms charged by victorious enemies who capture opponents under the honors of war. Finally, there are more prosaic costs that, although decidedly unmilitary, are essential to the mercenaries' business. These include recruiting costs to attract new soldiers or unattached veterans, to replace casualties or increase the size of a unit, benefits to troopers and their dependents, advertising costs, interest of potential employers in the unit, price of training, and a host of other businesses. You want to think about the administrative overhead, employing third-party accountants and lawyers and business people to help promote the unit and to look after the unit's interests and things like this. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that a mercenary unit might have to account for and have to deal with that a house unit generally doesn't have to worry about, because the house unit has a government who has agencies who have people who do the very same thing we're talking about. So they're already taken care of, and it's not part of their, considered part of their operating expenses. So, and then consumables. Supplies and ammunition in mercenaries' two dominant areas of expense. The need for supplies, food, water, fuel, clothes, and so on is constant. Of course, as ammunition is an expense mostly during campaigns, it usually crops up only when there is income to cover it. Whenever possible, a mercenary leader should obtain consumables through his own sources rather than his employers. A noble might neglect the quality and quantity of supplies furnished to mercenaries in favor of household troops. Smart mercenaries will take every opportunity to avoid an employer's cheese-sparing, profiteering, or bureaucracy. Hi, Frankie. You coming to say the party? You coming to join the party? Huh? You sniffing around? What are you doing? Yes. Yes. Come on, Frankie. Yes. Yes, Frankie. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I don't want you stepping on the laptop, right? Yes. That's Frankie. That's our cat. You got to get her 2 cents in. And I'm not sure if she's quite mercenary or not. Never know. Maintenance and refits. Once again, it's the same problem. The more you depend on your employer for anything, the more you're tied to those employers you are. There's a number of mercenary commands that have served the same employer for their entire existence. And for all intents purposes, they are kept troops. They might as well be a house unit. They're a house unit in everything but name. I'm thinking McCarran's Armored Cavalry, for example, have served House Leal since almost their conception. And while they are a mercenary unit, they do get paid that way. They do have some autonomy, and they do have some say in how they are used and how they operate. They're still basically a staple of a single house. And there's similar units like that in all the houses. So we got contracts, different types of missions, garrison duty, cater duty, security, riot, defensive campaigns, relief, planetary assault, offensive campaigns, siege, recons, objective raids, diversionary raids, guerrilla warfare, terms of employment. See, mercenary employment is regulated by carefully framed contracts that spell the rights and obligation to both employer and a unit's leader. Mercenaries are almost universally employed on a unit-wide basis, with only rare cases of individual soldiers contracting directly with a house or other employer, except a very small concern. Unit-wide employment protects mercenary bargaining power and security, blah, blah, blah. So, reunification, length of service, command rights. That's a tricky subject for a lot of mercenary units. Of course, their employers want as much control over what these mercs do, and there is this stigma for being a mercenary. A lot of non-mercenary people, forces, and have this tendency, especially house officers and troops, look down on mercenaries as being questionable or undependable. Because if you're willing to take money to do what you do, what's stopping somebody from coming along and giving you more money to switch sides and do so in the middle of something, and to the detriment of the people who did pay you hard coin? And there's a lot of mercenaries that would not do that. Their reputations are at stake as well, and the best mercenary commands know this, but there are still some less than savory outfits. And then there's such a thing as being put into an untenable situation. There are commanders who are not trustworthy on the other side of the fence. There are and have been instances where mercenary commands have been sacrificed so house units can survive or can escape, or to buy time, or are thrown into a meat grinder where it's not to the benefit or the interest of the mercenary unit to allow themselves to be ground up. They need to survive, and they need to survive intact. This causes some contention, lots of contention. So this is a very common, tricky thing that always can be the catalyst for all kinds of situations that come up and go down. Transportation, supplies, salvage rights. Another tricky situation for a lot of mercenary contracts and agreements. And just because you have an agreement with your employer doesn't necessarily mean that elements of your employer is going to honor that. And you might be back to that point where you need lawyers because you may need to fight them for it. So you go into your task, you go into combat, or you're involved in combat, and you take losses. Your machinery takes losses, sees damage. You need to make good on that stuff. You need to repair them. You need to replace them. And one of the most typical ways of doing that is salvaging the weapons and equipment from your foes. And so if your two mech units go to war and you manage to damage and down two of their machines and the rest of their unit vacates the field, you want to salvage those machines. Even if there are only parts of the machines left, there's still components within them that can be reused to repair your own stuff, or bartered or sold to acquire material that you need to fix your machines. Or if the machines are not so badly damaged, sometimes they can be repaired. They can be put back into the field. If you can get enough of this stuff, you might be able to augment your existing command force. You might be able to build your unit bigger. Well, your house lords and your employers see the same thing in that same value. So have your contract needs to be very specific, and then being able to enforce what your contract says can be critical. I mean, it's just one of those tricky things about being a mercenary. So we talk about the art of war, command tactics or grand tactics, jump ships, combat space, invasions, aerospace control, raids, field campaigns, maneuver, battles, morale, logistics. That's something I harp on all the time when I talk about the lack of jump ship transportation. No army can function without adequate access to supplies. High-tech armies are heavily tied to depots and supply lines. Mechs in particular need huge reserves of ammunition, spare parts, and repair services if they are to remain effective. In an age of high-speed transport and global communications, all the military forces on a planet can operate from a single supply depot. But that depot must be secure if the army is to fight. It is theoretically possible to live off the land using local resources and salvage equipment to keep troops in action, but under normal circumstances, this will work only for small raiding forces or guerrillas. So it's not uncommon for a lot of worlds to have central locations for their repair and resupply sources. And there's some downsides with that. Obviously, if you tie all your stuff into one location, that's where your enemy's going to come at you. They're going to come at you, they're going to come get you, or they're going to try to destroy it. And if you are capable of spreading these out in smaller catches, well, that's fine too, but it also has some issues as well, because if you have, once again, if your WASP actuator goes out and you need a replacement and it happens to be in a depot that's on the next continent on the other side of the planet, and your enemy has control of the airspace, it might take you a while to get that replacement. So, assuming you can get it at all. I mean, mercenaries or mercenary concerns, successor houses, Federated Sons, Learn Commonwealth, Compelling Confederation, other employers such as Comstar, Rebels and Secessionists, Merchants, Preferably Alliances, the Bandit Kings. Here's the thing about it, right? Like I said, there's so many entities that would employ mercenaries, and not just the traditional houses. Of all the houses, the Federated Sons traditional are the best ones if you're a mercenary, the best employer. And then that ironically, the Compelling Confederation is actually pretty good about taking care of their mercenaries and paying them well and seeing the value of them. The Draconis Combine's by far the worst, because in their Bushido lifestyle and mindset, their military, especially their command and control, really don't like mercenaries. The house does employ them, but you're not going to get the best deals, and you're going to run into lots of problems, lots of attitude, lots of supply chain issues. The Free Worlds League, they love and hate mercenaries. They employ them. The problem is that you're not sure who's employing who. There's so many small powers within the Free Worlds League, and everybody's in competition with each other. The House employs some, the smaller houses and minor houses and states employ some, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's not unheard of for mercenaries to be employed by two different factions within the Free Worlds League and find themselves in conflict with each other. It can be a bit. It's a good ground for smaller mercenary units, but it can still be a little dodgy because if you come out on the losing side of something, you might find yourself in Dutch, or your contract being null and void because your employer is no longer there to deal with it or to honor it. The Lyran Commonwealth, they're fairly good with mercenaries, but also their command structure has a tendency to look down their nose on them as well. So it's kind of a as you go. Comstar Comstar employs mercenaries on a small scale, mostly for far-flung operations or things that outside the inner sphere proper. This in 3025, nobody knows Comstar has a grand army and is stashed away, and Comstar has, aside for some security troops, they don't field mech units or of any at all. And if they do, they're employing small mercenary units to fill this role, or they're using mercenary units as a smokescreen for their actual comm guard units that are dressed up to look like mercenary units, but they're still few and far in between. But they do exist. Rebels and Secessionists. So if you have a planet, now this is where the Grey Death Legion gets its start, and a lot of its earliest campaigns start out this way. You're just getting your merc unit off the ground, and you need a contract. You need to get some income coming in, and maybe you decide to take on a cause. You're going to help some locals beat out. They're not happy with their overlord. They're not happy with the house, etc., etc. There's some upsides and downsides to that. Most likely is if you come out on the losing side, you're in trouble if you even survive the situation. Merchants are common for hiring mercenaries, but merchants tend to want infantry and light units. Uh, Mostly protect their goods, especially if they're traveling into some dodgy areas or into war zones or out in the periphery, so etc. and so on. Dirty deeds, logistics, the stranded mercenaries. So mercenaries depend on employers for transportation and risk being abandoned. As a deliberate policy, the employer will sacrifice a merc unit to save a house unit elsewhere. In instances, a mercenary unit may be abandoned because its ship commander panicked and pulled out, or because some senior strategist bungled, missed during transport intended to save stranded men. See, that's when you're looking at things like transportation costs and getting your units moved around. If you're a mercenary unit, you have to depend on hiring a third party to transport your units around. Finding a merchant who's willing to deliver your troops to a combat zone is going to be difficult, if not nearly impossible, and they're not going to be very reliable. They're not going to want to risk their drop ship or ships or their jump ship. If you're dealing with a house and the house is taking a bad loss, you know they got to cut their losses and leave. Your merc unit's likely to be one of those things that they write off because that's what they're going to do. Not all houses are this way, but within those houses are lots of elements, and some of those elements have no qualms about leaving you behind. So that's something most merc units want to have their own transportation as uh, early as possible, as soon as possible. The same with logistics. So if your merc units in a campaign and you're in support being supported by your employer, and your employer has other employer owned or employer mandated forces as well, those critical supplies start getting short. They're going to make sure most houses are going to make sure that their units get resupplied first, and the mercs second, maybe even third. There are a few that won't do that. There are a few military units that will value the mercenary command, especially if your mercenary command has got some reputation about it. The more reputable your unit is, the better treatment it's going to get. It's the way it is. All right. So, false intelligence, account restore, and then there's the other side of the coin: mercenary treachery, reluctance in the field. Mercenaries can avoid dangerous situations by deliberately moving and reacting slowly. Even Stonewall Jackson and Napoleon had their off days, and it was easy to maintain that. Bad fortune prevented the unit from reaching the battle site, providing the employer does not need a scapegoat or have witnesses to suggest the truth. As long as the campaign is moderately successful, mercs can put in a few appearances and no orders are directly disobeyed. An outfit can net easily campaign pay with a few normal risks. Or surrender. If things get south, your merc unit can surrender, and with the understanding that by doing so, that they're going to the person, the side you're surrendering to, is going to let them go. This goes against the reputation and is not a necessary. It's really bad for a merc unit to do more than once. Usually once is enough to make it so. You become your rating is very questionable, and you find it much harder to get good contracts. Changing sides, once again, the same scenario. This occurs. Probably the most well-known version of this was Sun Tzu. Or no, Hans Dabion manages agents at House of the Federation Sons managed to convince the Northwind Highlanders to abandon House Liao at a crucial point in the Fourth Succession War and return to their homeworld, place that had been promised to them by the Liaos for well over 100 and some odd years. And so 4 units of crack mercenary troops pack up all their stuff, their families, and truck home and leave their former employer in the lurch. Does not go over well. And there's ramifications some years later. Actually, since House Davion, or the Federated Sons, House Davion does not really do a good job of upholding their promise. They promised Northwind to be free and clear and be it self-ruling by the Northwind Highlanders, and they just eventually the Highlanders rebel against the Federated Sons too, changing sides, plunging locals, safeguards and sureties. Comstar, the Mercenaries Guild, conventions. As a neutral power, the universal power combining technical expertise and assembly religious fervor, Comstar wields vast respect and influence is ideal for broker mercenary service because the organization has capital and finance long-term investments and power to pursue and punish wrongdoers. So the Comstar's, and I know the name of it. I'm just drawing it blank in my head right now. Bonding Review and Bonding Commission eventually gets replaced by an outfit operated by Wolf's Dragoons later when they settle outreach and Comstar starts losing its points. Anyway, creating the mercenary unit, rules for doing so, using point system, outfitting your mercenaries, determining vehicles and equipment, availability tables, hirelings, reputation and morale, cost of living, the average salaries for 400 C bills a month for a green MechWarrior versus 2,000 C bills a month for a veteran, as an example. Maintenance cost tables, consumable supplies. What happens if you can't cover your monthly expenses, your overhead, hiring jump ships and drop ships, battle expenses, recording unit expenses, creating contracts, negotiation system for the rules, length of service, guarantees, remuneration, how much they're going to pay every month or every week, transport fees, supply fees, salvage rights, mission modifications, freestyle negotiations, an example, mercenary contract, campaign systems, campaign outcomes, morale, advanced campaign system, mission resolution, force commitment, force composition, strength values, enemy campaign operations, attrition, internal dissension, change of allegiance, reinforcements, treachery, betrayal, Comstar activity, referee contact, major campaign, technological advance, Starlink facility. A major Starlink facility or storehouse, administrative headquarters, military and naval bases discovered on Successor State world. As in the case of technological advance, rumors of the discovery will travel quickly through the inner sphere, drawing spies or military units from other houses to investigate or attempt to seize the facility. Fall of a major world, death of a major personage, change in house or house relations, friendly campaign operations, aerospace operations, salvage to see redetermined force commitment, tricks of the trade, employer betrayals, mercenary betrayals, Comstar mediation, reputation, select mercenary units. So we got Wilson's Hussars, Waco Rangers, and Eridani Light Horse. So we got all their symbols and their ranks and their ranking. We have a TOE for their 3 different regiments. Brief history, evacuation, dissension in the ranks. Originally, they were a member of the SLDF that remained behind, became termed mercenaries. Vince Hesperus, contract with Davion, contract requirements. So, example here. The Eridani Light Horse's only weakness is its inadequate number of techs. Therefore, Light Horse leaders always insist the employer furnish the unit with support personnel to repair and maintain its mechs. Also, they demand the right to negotiate supplying contracts with local commerce companies. This allows them to bypass their employer's military bureaucracy, which might neglect the needs of the mercenaries in favor of house units. Like many other mercenary units, the Light Horse requests a place to settle its dependents. This is a vital contract point, as these mercenaries firmly believe in keeping a sense of community. They also refuse to commit any act that would violate the never forgotten Ares conventions. Thus, they will never attack civilians, inflict undue harm on innocent peoples, or execute prisoners. Perhaps their only unusual contract point is that the employer must allow the Eridani to support personnel into his research facilities. Although this has irritated some employers, it does ensure the Light Horse mechs will be in the best possible shape to fight for its employer. Only the wily Hans Davion has had the audacity to turn this contract point around. He demanded that he was to permit mercenaries into his new Avalon Institute of Science, then the best of them must teach there. With a laugh, General Armstrong accepted his condition. The Eridani Light Horse is well satisfied with his relations with the Federated Sons. Prince Davion exceeded most of the Light Horse's specification. He even sells mechs to the unit at cost. General Armstrong respects the prince, so he plans to remain in the Federated Sons for a long, long time. Unit traditions, selected personalities. And we got a roster, more in detail roster of the various lances and companies and battalions that make up the Light Horse. And as you can see, once again, this is what I mean by the passive books. Their bindings, they give out, and then once again, I keep in a plastic bag because that way I don't lose pages. Waco's Rangers. Once again, same thing. Sworn enemies. Brush with the Widow. Steiner years. Unit description. These break down some examples of their uniforms. Wilson's Hussars. Often derisively labeled Wilson's Wimps, these desperate MechWarriors are commonly completely out of luck. Under the leadership of Captain David Wilson, Hussars will accept any assignment from any employer to help them escape their current situation. They are always strapped for cash, strapped for parts, etc. Eventually end up in the periphery dealing with one of the would-be bandit lords. is an example of the bottom end of mercenary commands. Worksheets, filling out a unit worksheet, table organization example, blank worksheet for unit, unit composition for, supply data chart, and a mercenary contract. Ready to be Xeroxed off. So, mercenaries. The 31st century war has raged in the successor states for over 200 years. In the ongoing conflict, mercenary soldiers have ample opportunity to sink his fortune under the banner of one of the great houses. A career fraught with danger, but rich with potential rewards. Right? Like I said, a lot of times, so like the Pre-World League, for example, one of the things that gives them the captain general is hamstrung by the fact that most of his military, 2/3 of his military are provincial forces, and because of the way they're structured, he can't call on them or use them or divert them places where he needs them, and he can't focus them or mass them to take offensive actions against his neighbors. Very often, it's just a mess. So one of the ways he gets around the captain general gets around that is by employing mercenaries. This gives them some leverage. And some years later, when the Ragazul is separated from the House Kurita and forms its own state, they absolutely detest mercenaries. And there's at one point they literally won't hire them at all. And this causes a problem. Well, it doesn't help their case when the clans come in and pour right down through their neck of the woods. There's also a point when the House Kurita, after the incident with Wolf's Dragoons, House Kurita actually declares death to all mercenaries, which means nobody wants to work for House Kurita for some time. It's not until after Takashi passes away and Theodore is able to ease that situation that they start employing mercenaries again, and it comes in the nick of time because it's mercenaries that help save Luthien from falling to the clans. Just saying. The of all the combat units, I've been more favored having mercenary units as player character as from personal preference, because one of the advantages of representing a mercenary command in the game is that you have the option and the luxury to play with all the houses. You can serve all the houses. You can serve factions within the houses. You can find yourself in a lot of diverse scenarios. If you favor House Kurita and you play House Kurita all the time, you're always going to be House Kurita, and that's how you're developed, and you tie yourself in. It's how you get used to operating your forces, etc., etc. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying this is one of those things, these pieces of BattleTech that makes it so interesting and so varied is this. This ability to bring to be represented a non-house tied force, because it just is. That's my personal opinion. Anyway, this is Rick, and you guys have a great weekend.